Hello, welcome to the World Humanitarian Forum's webinar series, co-organized with the GHAEA, or GHAEA, the Global Humanitarian Action Executive Alliance. I'm Hans-Peter Teufels, the International Director of the UPS Foundation, and I have to apologize for my colleague Jim Coughlin, who was asked to be part of Operation Warp Speed, thus meaning that he had to go to Washington, D.C. and can join. So I would like to lead you through a hopefully interesting and lively discussion. To start with, the hosts, which is the World Humanitarian Forum. So thanks a lot for organizing this webinar for all of us. WHF is the largest and most inclusive nonpartisan forum in humanitarian aid and international development, bringing together decision makers and opinion formers in the public, private, and non-profit sector, as well as the next generation of partnership builders. WHF is well known for the annual forum in London, and they recently held forum at around the UNGA in New York. The Global Humanitarian Action Executive Alliance is a multi-stakeholder platform where business leaders, for instance, BD Foundation, as well as UPS, the UPS Foundation, are working on accelerating progress towards achieving the SDGs, Partnership for the Goals, in delivering humanitarian assistance. We bring in expertise, we bring in knowledge, resources, while exploring collaborative models for more effective private sector engagement in emergency preparedness and response. We have hopefully 3 participants with His Excellency, Mr. Gamal Mohamed Hassan, the Minister of Planning, Investment and Economic Promotion of the Federal Government of Somalia. The Minister is a couple of minutes late, I was told, so bear with us. He will come in later. And we have Dr. Abubakar Campo, Director of Health, UNICEF. And last but not least, Mr. Gary Cohen, the Executive Vice President, Global Health and President of the BD Foundation. So what are we going to talk about today? Now, the delivering of vaccine against COVID-19 was the highest priority topic in 2020. First registration processes are running or have even been accomplished, so other questions are getting relevant now. Fair access, distribution schemes, supply chains are topic of these weeks. After we probably had at least felt 90% of the population in a given country being an expert on how to avoid COVID in one or the other way, we might now have very deep dives in public discussions on logistics, fairness, vaccination levels that would lead to immunization. We want today add truth and facts to the discussion to make sure that valuable opinions are not getting unheard. So we are going to discuss with my honorable guests and discussants what challenges are anticipated with equitable access to COVID-19 diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines, and how global partnerships might overcome them. We will start with a round of introductions to the topic from the participants, then move into individual questions, and finally take questions from the audience. The hour is short, so therefore I will be your timekeeper, and I hope that we are able to end up with short summaries that has all to do with whether we are disciplined or not. So, without any further time, I will hand over to you. And I don't see Minister Hassan in here right now. So therefore, I would ask Abu if you could probably start with your opinion, with your intervention on from UNICEF. Thanks a lot. Over to you.
Thank you, Hans-Peter, and thank you for the World Humanitarian Forum to having UNICEF part of the discussion. I'm Dr. Abubakar Campo. I'm the Global Director for Program Health within UNICEF. You may know that UNICEF is one of the largest vaccine procurers in the world, with about 2 billion of vaccines procured for normal routine immunization programs around the world. And in this sense, with the introductions of the new COVID-19 vaccines, which are out there, We are part of the COVAX facility, and UNICEF is the lead on procurement, international freight arrangements, as well as in-country logistics for those new vaccines when they will be available on the market and for distributions for different parts of the world. Let me stop here and maybe hand over to Gary.
Well, first, thank you, Hans-Peter, and World Humanitarian Forum and the GHAEA, the Global Alliance of Executive Action, for this opportunity to speak. And I'm going to start a little bit in broad terms. You know, we're right in the midst of the pandemic now and deep in it, and so much still needs to be done, but there's light at the end of the tunnel because of the progress in developing the vaccines. And I think we can't take anything for granted, that we have to have effective and accountable multilateral mechanisms that lead and orchestrate across sectors to achieve the virus control and equity goals. Fortunately, the COVAX and ACT Accelerator have been established. So there are those multilateral mechanisms for procuring and distributing vaccines and diagnostics and other essential equipment. And we have UNICEF to lead the administration of the vaccine in low and middle income countries. And thank goodness UNICEF is there. I'll make some additional comments in a moment. I serve on the board of UNICEF in the US, so I'm very familiar with the organization. I'm going to briefly touch on three topics: equity, safety, and hesitancy. And equity being defined as access for all countries and populations, and ensuring appropriate distribution and access in low-income countries in particular. Safety goes beyond the safety of the development of the vaccine itself. You know, I have confidence that the leading private sector companies that have developed vaccines are going through all the appropriate safety protocols, but there also are safety issues in delivery, maintaining cold chain, for example, and in low-income countries, preventing the reuse of the vaccination devices themselves, which has been achieved over several decades in childhood immunization programs. That has to be carried over now into these programs that have different target populations. And then hesitancy, which I think is actually going to be the biggest challenge to overcome, maybe less so in developing countries, but ironically and unfortunately in developed countries and middle income countries, the anti-vax movement is very well organized, and we're going to have to overcome hesitancy concerns. Now, I think I have a couple more minutes, so let me just touch on each of these topics. So UNICEF is the lead agency for the COVAX facility. It will serve 92 countries and is the technical lead for country national vaccine deployment plans. And they are taking on a massive responsibility. They have to lead the vaccination of entirely new target groups, which include health workers and elderly to start, and ultimately the full adult populations, while sustaining the childhood immunization programs that they've historically administered every year. This is the first time this has been done in history. It's uncharted territory. We have huge reliance on UNICEF, and therefore UNICEF requires our huge support. We also need to deal with different vaccines. These are, different manufacturers have different vaccines that have different characteristics, different cold chain requirements, and even different dosage requirements. This even affects what we do as BD, because the design of the devices that we're going to provide for the vaccine delivery has to be adjusted for the different types of vaccines. So there is complexity here. So again, UNICEF must be sufficiently supported on this by governments and by donors. On safety, I'll just briefly mention this. Maybe I'll come back to it later in the discussion, but up until the late 1980s, in the mass immunization programs for children, which were hugely successful, led by UNICEF and WHO, there was a problem. And that was the devices used to deliver the vaccines were being reused, and that was spreading diseases among children, particularly hepatitis. Reuse of single-use injection devices is actually the largest cause of hepatitis spread in the world, or at least was up until a certain point. Through cross-sector collaboration, that source of disease spread has been all but eliminated through a special design of devices that stop functioning after one use. They're called Autodisable devices. These will be critical for the rollout of the vaccine in developing countries, because the tendency is naturally to reuse a device, even though it's designed for single use. So I will come back to that. We're working with UNICEF, other manufacturers are as well, to ensure safety in the delivery of the devices. And of course, there's a lot of emphasis on the cold chain issues. Lastly, hesitancy. I'll just touch upon this briefly now. We can come back to it. This is a very frustrating issue. There is a highly mobilized anti-vaccination movement worldwide. It started in the US. It leverages social media to spread disinformation. And it doesn't need to prove its case. It only needs to sow the seeds of doubt, to put a question in people's mind. And that is the methodology that conspiracy theorists use. And this is a conspiracy theory method overall that they're doing. It's not always clear where the lead is coming from. And in particular, in my opinion, we're not prepared to deal with this yet. We've invested billions of dollars and overcome huge technical hurdles to develop new vaccines. We're going to have to overcome huge behavioral hurdles to enable the level of vaccination required ultimately to achieve near elimination of this virus. Whether this ends up requiring annual vaccination or whether the initial administrations of the vaccine will eliminate COVID is not known yet, but we do have to overcome this. And again, I'd like to come back to this issue because I actually think it's going to be our largest challenge, maybe a little less so in developing countries that have more experience dealing with infectious disease pandemics than the developed countries do.
Thanks, Gary. And I would dive into that hesitancy topic a little bit because we have time anyways. And having Abu here in the call, I mean, Abu, UNICEF has done vaccination since decades, right? Especially in developing countries or organized vaccination. So what is the experience there? I mean, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of doses did you distribute over the past decade? It must be enormous. And how's the experience in that regard? Over.
I think Hans-Peter, I mean, Gary is right. I think hesitancy has been prevalent. I mean, even in developing countries, in poor countries, for different reasons. I think it's always an issue of trust, you know, whether you trust your political leaders, whether you trust your health systems, whether it's a different agenda. I mean, you can come into a conflict, into a conflict areas where you have different participants, and when vaccines are coming from a particular part of the world, which are involved in the conflict, it gets political. When we're looking, for example, into COVID-19's hesitancy, you know, we must say that, you know, politics has played a big role. I mean, we're not sure when vaccines productions has been started or has been commenced, and in 4 months' time, you know, we are on the part of having vaccines out there, and this information made people worried because we know that vaccines production takes much longer than that. That's number one. Number two, we have been very inconsistent with our messages as well. And you've learned to build trust, you need to be consistent, but you cannot say today one thing and tomorrow you say another thing, and then you have somebody else conflicting you from, you know, the same group of people who are actually looking to vaccines management. Well, it creates distrust within the community themselves. And then we need to look also in terms of how health workers themselves are behaving within the health system themselves. You know, if populations are coming to a facility and you have an anti-sentiment, you know, towards your patient or towards your client, it doesn't build necessary trust, and it fuels, you know, this anti-sentiment against immunization. And then you have, you know, these anti-vaccination groups who, and Gary is right, says they don't need much, they don't play by the rules. They use one event and they spill it over to a generality, which basically then just fuels rumors, and rumors becomes reality. And it's very difficult to undo them in a certain sense. The way how we overcome those ones is, you know, basing our argumentations on facts, being consistent with our messages, you know, from multiple medias, and communicating transparently. I think that's one of the key elements which we need to put out there. Now, will it eradicate, you know, the anti-immunization sentiments or anti-immunization groups? Not necessarily, because some of them are very political. I mean, they have their own agenda, and for them, you know, science is not necessarily at the heart of their argumentations. It is just an ideology which they're basically promoting, and it's sometimes difficult for the scientific communities to overcome this. But at the end of the day, I think what is also important is that we have in the past as well not necessarily taken always the same the right directions in terms of introducing new vaccines. we need to work with the community and not doing things for the community. And I think sometimes we need to listen to the communities as well. In many communities in developing areas, their priority is not necessarily a vaccine. Their priority, they have completely different priorities. And then when we're imposing them a certain commodity, while maybe water is more important for them than having a vaccine shot for COVID-19, and then the whole discussions is about COVID-19 in the private community, it's completely interpreted differently, because they have been claiming and they have been asking for government for support for so many things, and they have never been heard. And then suddenly we're coming in with the vaccines. Now everybody is forced to get these vaccines. It always creates suspicion. And I think we need to work much more with those community, listen to them, take into account their priorities, and then insert what is important for us in terms of vaccination in that sense. I think this will build a much stronger trusted relationship between the provider and the recipient of these vaccines. And definitely with time, we have been overcoming in some of the areas. We still have challenges with some of the vaccines. I think our biggest experience has been with polio, where in some of the countries where we're still having issues with polio eradication, it has been an issue of trust, where we have been doing campaigns year and year again, and population could not understand why we are vaccinating children for 12 times in a year with one vaccines, and then for other vaccines, we are only vaccinating them too. And it even creates then rumors and suspicions, which get fueled, taken up by the anti-vaccination communities, and they do something else with it. Again, the solution for that is open communication, transparent communication, and consistent communications, and also take into account what matters for those communities as well.
Thanks, Abu. This is a very, very important topic that we probably want to go deeper into that. But before we do, I would welcome His Excellency Mr. Gamal Mohammed Hassan, Minister from Somalia. Welcome, Minister. And I'm the moderator. My name is Hans-Peter Teufels from the UPS Foundation. And we have Dr. Abubakar Campo from UNICEF and Mr. Gary Cohen from BD. We started the discussion already. And what I would like to ask you, if I may, can we have your introductory presentation or your introductory words on the topic? We have started talking about partnerships and what challenges for equitable distribution we have. And we are now just diving into some of the topics that were raised. So please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was running a little late. There was just mix up the timing issue on our side. Very happy to be with you, calling from Mogadishu, late afternoon. So wherever you are, good afternoon or morning. Just to talk about the topic, but just give you a background. Somalia is going through a post-conflict transition phase. Despite the progress, though, we are still facing all kinds of humanitarian issues. Large number of IDPs, one of the largest in the region. The humanitarian response plan has always been close to $1 billion every year, the calls that the UN makes. Lots of challenges compounded by the COVID pandemic now. All this put together and all the climate shocks that we go through every few months or years, cyclical droughts, flooding, locust inflation now. So the humanitarian situation is very complex, very different from year to year, month to month. So looking at the whole region, I think we are doing fine compared to some of our neighbors in some areas. But the fragility, the level of fragility and the susceptibility to disasters and climate issues are there. So I will talk about the details about COVID and the issues we're dealing with, but the humanitarian, just to recap, the humanitarian situation in Somalia has been in the last few years in a very precarious situation, on and off, here and there. But we're very hopeful that things will change in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister Hassan. If I may just follow up with one question that we started to discuss. Gary introduced some main obstacles for vaccination processes, and one of it was hesitancy, where Abu Campo has filled some gaps in my knowledge in that every vaccination process needs to be fact-based and consistent, and that we would have communities. So it's hesitancy factor in your country. I mean, it's a low middle income country, so probably a good example. So what do you think how this will work when vaccination is arriving? Over to you. Sorry. Okay, so we have a disconnect here. Minister Hassan, I was asking a question on hesitancy of the population to accept vaccines. I'm not sure whether you got that question, so therefore I'm repeating it. We had the discussion before you entered the roundtable. How do you think hesitancy will impact the vaccination process in your?
Yes. Not only COVID vaccination, but generally all vaccines, people are always hesitant. They don't know what will happen. In our country, for instance, majority, over 75% Somalis are under the age of 30. So the real impact of the COVID it has not been experienced. Fortunately, the loss of human life is lower compared to other countries. So today, I just came up from a cabinet meeting. One of the key issues, like any government, is how to inform the public about the vaccines. What is the platform that we can use? How can we access vaccines? What means and methods we can use to encourage people to go and take the vaccinations? So we are exploring options and areas that we can use. For instance, when the COVID started early this year, it was difficult to convince people, for example, the youth, to cover their faces, the social distancing. We had serious challenges. Some of the religious places, we had to go to the mosques, the schools to be shut down. So it was difficult to adjust to the environment of protection. Now, the other phase, to convince people that another step is needed to vaccine ourselves and our communities to make sure that we save more lives. So we will probably use the same method, a combination of public awareness, using the traditional social media, using the religious scholars, using teachers, using different methods and means. So it's an uphill battle to convince people who were, to begin with, hesitant of the COVID in itself. So we have to double our efforts and continue engaging the public through different means and ways. So it's going to be a challenge, but we will do it. We'll do it for sure.
Okay. Thanks, Minister Hassan. I would pick up on one thing that you said, where you said that the citizens would go for vaccination. That is probably something that is relatively unclear how that will work at the end of the day. And I would hand over to Gary, talking about vaccination safety, especially considering that the delivery of vaccines in low resource settings is a substantial challenge. So maybe you can talk about what specific challenges BD face regarding delivery and the prevention of disease, and I hope that you can also outline BD's work on diagnostics, which is as important as the vaccination process itself. Over to you, Gary.
Oh, sure, Hans-Peter. So I'm just going to make a couple additional comments on hesitancy, and then I'll move on to safety and diagnostics. So first on the issue of hesitancy, this is not specific to any particular country, but I would say overall, we are underprepared to deal with the hesitancy issues, whether it's the conspiracy theories that is coming out of the anti-vax movement or the inherent mistrust that exists in communities and varies by community around the world. We've invested so much more on the technical side, and we have underinvested in the behavioral side. We should have the world's leading behavioral scientists working on this issue, and we need a multilateral mechanism with defined accountabilities, in my viewpoint, to create the type of communication and support materials and to be putting out broad-based communications that will have influence on this. I think we're underestimating how significant this will be as a factor. You know, back in 1954, when Jonas Salk developed the Salk polio vaccine, similar in some ways, a different type of disease, but similarly important to the world didn't have these types of hesitancy issues. This is an outcome of growth of mistrust in society and the growth and the impact of social media. And I would add also conflicting messages from leadership. You know, so people are not just going to line up. Now, UNICEF does have a lot of experience dealing with vaccine hesitancy. I can tell you from my own personal experience, in 1998, BD partnered with UNICEF to eliminate maternal and neonatal tetanus. It's a insidious disease picked up during childbirth from spores in the soil. It would take the life of the newborn within 8 days, often take the life of the mother. To address that, you have to vaccinate all women of childbearing age and girls, about age 13 to as old as age 60, 3 times. And rumors go around in villages that this is being done to sterilize them, that it's not being done to save the lives of their lives and the lives of their newborns. And once you immunize 3 times, it protects the women and their newborns for life. UNICEF led that immunization work, and I've traveled personally with UNICEF to immunization stations in Mali. I also traveled in Mozambique for measles immunization. UNICEF has a lot of experience in how to deal with the local issues, and those are going to probably be as strong or stronger around COVID-19 as they have for any past vaccination campaign. Again, UNICEF needs our support here, and we also need global mobilization. You know, we've done something, we being BD, with many partners around antimicrobial resistance that I'm just going to mention as a benchmark. It's called the Antimicrobial Resistance Fighter Coalition. You can find it on the website antimicrobialresistancefighters.org. And what it is a global mobilization of leaders from 50 countries committing themselves to address antimicrobial resistance and spread awareness and mobilize action. That type of mechanism, something like that, as a global partnership, I believe is needed for COVID-19 as we roll out these new vaccines. There's also another initiative I've been providing pro bono advisory support to called COVID Smart, which is a training program that can be done on a mobile phone or online, extensive, around what people need to know in terms of protecting themselves and now transitioning to rolling out the vaccines. We need to invest more in these mechanisms. Now, in terms of safety, as I briefly mentioned before, up until the late 1980s, UNICEF was aware, WHO was aware that disease was also being spread during mass immunization due to reuse of the devices. But there was a desire not to interrupt these essential vaccination programs. That led to the development of Autodisable technology. The first examples were in the early 1990s. It took about 9 years for this new technology, this new simple technology, to become broadly available. And it required UNICEF and WHO and the Red Cross and others to change policy, and then Gavi to come in with funding and ultimately require the use of these types of devices. They cost pennies. They stopped working after a single use. They physically lock after a single use, thereby preventing any reuse of the devices, which, among other things, had been the leading cause of hepatitis spread in the world, also can spread HIV. As we're now engaging with UNICEF for rollout and vaccination for COVID-19, we are ensuring that those are the types of devices that are supplied into low and middle income countries, and that they're tailored to the different dosage requirements of the different vaccine candidates. So there's a little bit more complexity to this than initially people might think. And in general, just scaling up the delivery devices. We've already committed more than 800 million devices to governments around the world, including 100 million Autodisable devices to UNICEF, and there'll be much more to come. And this required a substantial recapitalization of our own production. Likewise, you mentioned diagnostics. We're one of the companies that has rapidly developed and mobilized both antigen and PCR testing. And those are being supplied now in the tens of millions by BD and other companies around the world. This was the most rapid development of new diagnostics in history. Things that normally would have taken years to develop and then work through the regulatory process were done in weeks to months. And this also required a reorganization of how we operate as a large company. It was all hands on deck with redeployment of people into the diagnostic and vaccination areas and substantial changes in production. I would say, likewise, the vaccine companies have done simply remarkable work. And as we talk about equity, we want to make sure those new vaccines are accessible in low and middle income countries. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that without the participation of the private sector, we wouldn't have vaccines to deliver. So each sector, governments, multilateral agencies, including UN agencies, businesses, and civil society each have a critical role to play here. And it has to be orchestrated across those sectors to be effective, whether that's in country or on a global basis. And when we pull that all together well, that's when amazing accomplishments happen. You can think about HIV and AIDS as an example. Once all that came together, the therapeutics at accessible pricing, that took several years. And then the mechanisms, multilateral mechanisms to fund and manage the rollout of antiretroviral treatment, as well as laboratory testing, and the disease started to become under much better control. So we need to think about those examples as we now move into this critical phase for COVID-19.
Thanks, Gary. Before heading over to one of the very, very relevant questions, which is equitable access, I would like to briefly dive into another topic that has been strived a little bit. Excuse me. And this is supply chains. I mean, we are right in the middle of it. As UPS, as most of you will know, we are working with a number of distributors. We have looked into the topic with partners like UNICEF, like the World Food Program and others, to try to find out what a potential role UPS can play. And in a lot of cases, we will be transporting the vaccines. But there's one important point that I have raised in all the discussions over the past months, and that is once we are getting into ultra cold chain, and that's probably the worst case scenario, but apparently we are going into that. How we are dealing with that, and especially how are we dealing with that on the last mile? So I keep it general because I think with that discussion we can fill easily 1 hour. So therefore I stop here and would ask that question to all of you, as those supply chains are quite vital right now to distribute. What are the current challenges you see in cold chain storage, in potential solution, but especially as well in what's going on the last mile? So Gary, I stretched you a lot, so maybe I can ask Abu to start with.
Sure. Thanks, Hans-Peter. I think it's a very important question, and I think it raises always, again, when vaccines basically generated, we assess them for safety and efficiency, but not necessarily for, feasibility in terms of deployment, and this needs to be somehow be taken into account. We always say that the easier the logistic of the vaccines, the better will be the equitable distributions, of this particular product. It's not just vaccines. I mean, any kind of pharmaceutical product, the easier it can be administrated or the easier you can have the logistics, I think the greater will be the equitable distributions around the globe. Now, coming back to your questions on ultra cold chain, I think we have been having some experience, in specific countries like those who have been affected by Ebola, because they're using basically also ultra cold chain equipment. And it has been a challenge for us to put them in place, but these countries we have put ultra cold chain in place for that, because we were testing Ebola vaccines in those countries as well. But it takes time, and there needs to be a time lag for basically putting this infrastructure in place. As well, we're looking at the global pandemic. So if you want to deploy ultra cold chains, it's quite big in volume. So it's not something which can be done just overnight. And you need to have those installations basically to make sure that vaccine can be basically deployed in those countries. We do have experience with it, but we will still, from the UNICEF perspective, we're looking and we're hoping that that the other candidates of vaccines will be coming out, which do not necessarily necessitate ultra cold chain equipment, because otherwise it is. In particular, for the last mile, even within the country, it will be an issue of equity to basically distribute the vaccines and get population to vaccinate. Now, coming back to vaccine hesitancies, again, the more complicated it becomes for vaccines, the more we're fueling again, the mistrust. Why do we need this for this particular vaccines, and why do we need this for the other vaccines? Is there something in these vaccines which makes it particular and is a threat to that? So I think we need to take into account all these different elements, before we basically are deploying this vaccine. I don't think it's just ultra cold chain. I think the other element that we have with the MNR is basically also the quantity. I mean, we are injecting 0.3 ml into people, and we do not have standard syringes as for now of 0.3 ml. So what do we do? Are we taking a 0.5 and we know what can happen when we're using 0.5, or are we taking a 1 ml, which is basically graduated with the risk of having inconsistencies of what will be injected into the different individuals? And I think there will be coming. I think it will be addressed. I think the syringes might be not the bigger issues. It will be addressed, and probably we will be having a production of 0.3 mLs. Very soon on the market, which will maybe address this particular issue. But then at the same time, we have the diluent program, because the Pfizer is producing the vaccines, but not necessarily the diluent. So what we are requesting is that some of these things are bundled, so that we can basically send them into the country as a bundle, rather than having them from different suppliers and making sure that this can be addressed. So I think there are multiple challenges with that. And my last point, not really diverting from your question, is that we have been doing pretty well for vaccinating children, but we're having a different populations right now, and I think adults is a little bit more complicated, because it seems to me that it's easier to vaccinate children than adults. Adults are even much more refractory to immunizations than even children, which depends. Bring in and say, vaccinate my child, but the adults themselves are not coming forward to actually get vaccinated. And I think it is an additional complexity, but I don't think it's complexities which we cannot overcome. I think, as Gary has said, if we work together, and I think it is great that we have already vaccines basically available, we should just make sure that we learn from the mistakes from the past, not doing them again, and make sure that we have a smooth rollout as best as possible, so that we get to the last mile. The last mile will be an issue, in particular for ultra cold chain equipment. This will be an issue because it's not just about having the equipment, it's having electricity available, it's having people managing at the last point mile. And that's, I think the Honorable Minister might be speaking a little bit more eloquently about this, but these have been issues which have been plagued, immunization programs for years.
Hans-Peter, can I make one quick comment in response to Dr. Abu? That
of course, please go ahead, Gary.
I have good news on one of the technical challenges in terms of the dosage. One of the advantages of the auto-disable design that we offer is we can also preset it to the appropriate dose. And in our production planning, we're now tailoring the design of the auto-disable immunization device to the specific vaccine. So the 0.3, which is the Pfizer vaccine, it will be preset so that the administrator of the vaccine only needs to pull back, and it will lock at the 0.3 dose and then push, and it will deliver. And that's something unique to the auto-disable design. these devices do a lot. They cost literally pennies, 4 or 5 cents each. And yet they protect against reuse of the device, so they protect disease spread, and they also make it easier for the vaccinator to not even have to think about looking for the dose. It's automatically preset to pull in the right dose. And we'll be doing that for 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, whatever the various vaccine requirements indicate. But the challenge there also will be to ensure the right devices are aligned with those vaccine candidates.
Thanks, Gary. Very important, and it probably helps with losing a little bit of complexity. So what I see here is what we are simply adding are additional layers of complexity. Just to follow on Abu's comments related to overcoming the challenges that are there. I mean, I don't see it that negative, but it is good to know that in advance to make sure that we find a recipe on how to deal with it, right? I think that is what the discussion is about. Now, I would get back to Minister Hassan. I don't want to ask an unfair question, so therefore I don't ask, are you prepared to deal with it? Because I know nobody is prepared right now, because we know about the vaccination and since a couple of weeks, and the problem of minus 80 degrees came up in the past weeks as well. So no country is really prepared for that in an easy way. But how are you seeing that as a representative of LMIC, so low middle income country, vaccination, transportation, supply chains, and then the last mile as well? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. Very good question. I think we are all on the same page globally. We're all preparing for the acquisition and the potential rollout of all the vaccines to relevant communities. We are trying our level best. The issue in Somalia or neighboring countries or all the SCD countries is the level of the amount of cold chain you need and the specifications. Different companies produce different products or are producing different products. So we hope to be able to afford setting up the cold chain is needed in time before we import the vaccinations. We also need to plan very well the rollout, and keeping in mind the hesitations and the challenges, that cultural or otherwise, of administering the vaccines across the country. So it's a complex issue, but the fact that the pandemic had so much impact globally, people are somehow mentally ready to get out of the situation, and we hope they will take the vaccines. We're just trying to tell them, look, this is going to be here and stay here forever unless we do something about it. So the messaging campaign that we are starting to do in the next few days is resonating already with some of the key targeted communities that we identify. It is not going to be an easy task, but it's really it's going to be, I think transportation will be one of the key areas. The aviation industry was heavily impacted by the COVID, one of the key industries that suffered the most. So reviving that industry itself and using that industry itself has been a challenge. And hopefully we are in touch with WHO and other organizations, regional and globally. We are hoping that the rollout and vaccinations will be easier this time than other campaigns, whether it's, in previously the smallpox and all this and, others. Because this had impacted everybody. It's just one shot, 2020, everybody from the United States all the way to the smallest country, everyone is talking about COVID-19. So the messaging that maybe Gary can deliver in his country is the same as the one I'm doing here, or Abu Bakr is doing there. Because we're all talking about, administering vaccinations to selectors like elderly and people with pre-existing conditions, and it's the same thing here. Most likely the kids will be the last in line, but we are all doing the same. So we're learning from other experience, we learn from other people, we're just borrowing even some ideas from some of our partner countries, partner organizations, and neighboring countries. So that's that. And since we have invested so much effort in producing this vaccine in a very short period of time, this is a record setting, to be honest. We cannot afford to fail in the last minute. Now, thanks to the great minds of the scientists and these companies that are doing this wonderful job, I think the job now, the delivery of the job and the completion task lays on all of us tables. Everybody, all of us participate. Very few brilliant minds came up with the vaccine. Now all of us, the rest of us, need to do our work and deliver. Thank you.
Hans-Peter, can I
Many thanks, Gamal.
Can I just
please, Abu, go ahead. Yeah.
I think also let's look also very pragmatically. I think the situation will be that it's not that there will be a huge amount of volume of vaccines available to vaccinate the entire population. So I think the way how the COVAX facility is planning right now is for 20% of the populations right now. And I think you're trying to do an equitable distributions per country. And even within the countries, there's a prioritization process right now to determine, who should be the first candidates of receiving those vaccines. In most of the cases, most likely it will be the elderly and the health workers, so that they can continue rendering their services. Most likely this will be happening. I think there's also hope that the other vaccine candidates will be approved with times which have not this kind of complexity. It will be allowing us to basically last mile, which you mentioned, without necessarily having these ultra-quenching equipments there. So I think we need to be quite optimistic as well. Not thinking that we have to have a huge general deployment of bringing the ultra-quenching equipment everywhere into the country, because this will be definitely not be feasible in the near future. I think it will take quite a lot of time. It took UNICEF just 5 years to deploy 14,000 solar fridges, which are basically the normal quenching equipment over the time. So I think there will be different processes coming together, which should be helping us basically facilitating this entire process, so that we're not just thinking about one commodity which needs to be deployed. The second element, which I would like to think as well, and I said it before, the easier the logistics about the vaccine, the better it is for equity. Now, giving 1 dose compared to 2 doses is an issue. If it would always be better to have a 1-dose vaccines, which makes it easier, because it is not necessarily that easy to bring people back to come for a second shot. They will come for the first one. Coming for the second one, you will have attrition, what we call attrition rate there as well. So the more we go into the future, I want to believe that there will be other candidate vaccines out there, which will be at the discretions for governments to accept those vaccines. And as long as we have a multiple plateau, it will make it much easier basically to then cover our populations than just thinking about the complexity of one vaccines which we have there, which I don't think makes that sense, just to focusing on the difficulties just on the Pfizer vaccines, which might be adopted in one specific context and very easily to deploy it in that particular context. But there will be other candidates out, and we will be using those opportunities to make sure that equity gets not lost just in the discussions about one vaccine.
Peter, can I make maybe
Thanks, Abu.
Based on what Honorable Minister Hassan and Dr. Abu have just said. So first, I very much, Minister Hassan, agree with your view. We all are in the same boat, so to speak. Every person, every citizen of the world is facing the same circumstance of threat with COVID. And you would think that would have pulled us together as a global community. It really was an opportunity for us to share this common experience and be pulled together. And unfortunately, I think only to a degree that's happened. And there's dissension, even more so within countries. And here in the United States, politicization of the virus that has unfortunately caused unnecessary dissension. I would say also that in my experience, because I work with countries all over the world, I think countries in sub-Saharan Africa actually are at an advantage in a number of ways. First, there's more experience dealing with infectious disease, based on past experiences, HIV and Ebola. And I believe that the type of dissension we've seen in the US has been, to some degree, and also in Europe, by the way, an outcome of having less experience. And therefore people, sometimes putting too much priority on social interaction and parties and doing things like that. Of course, seeing family, which is very important, relative to understanding what the real impact is when a highly infectious disease spreads. Also, sub-Saharan Africa benefits from a young population. We've, through GBC Health, where I serve as co-chair, we've been working with UNFPA on the demographic dividend, which is the benefit of the young population. And we know that while young people can contract the disease, they're less likely to have very severe symptoms. And in that respect, the unfortunate circumstance where the vaccine access may be delayed because the developed countries are doing everything they can to stockpile may also allow that time for what Dr. Abu indicated, that vaccines don't require ultra cold chain and may only require one dose will be more feasible for rollout to the general population. So I think it'll be important to see how this all unfolds, and we have to do everything we can to create access, but also recognize that the developed countries, the industrialized countries, have a lot to learn here from the low-income countries in this circumstance.
And Peter, maybe one last point, because I think we're talking a lot about vaccines, but I want to make sure that our message is very clear. I think we need to still adhere to public health actions, which is basically washing our hands for 20 seconds with soap, wearing the mask, and social distancing. I don't think that the introduction of any vaccine should be basically lowering our guard, because I think to fight the pandemic and to get these epidemics under control, it is in interactions between immunization, so vaccinations, and still, doing preventive measures, which is hand washing, social distancing, and wearing the mask when you are in public, and where you cannot control basically your environment. I think it's important that we make these notions and not just talking about the vaccines, because we always have the tendencies of thinking that it is a golden bullet, and yet, it doesn't. So it's not. There needs to be a combination of actions to get the pandemic under control.
Yeah, I fully agree, and thanks a lot for mentioning that. So we shouldn't forget when we are talking about COVID that what we have implemented in the past with the protection measures need to be kept up. And I'm assuming that this will carry on for quite a while, most likely until 2022, or if not beyond, right? So we might like it or not. Now, very positive on one hand, so we have a complexity of supporting factors on the other side that might help us go through the vaccination process. Now, the point is, a lot of questions as well from the audience were related to fair and equitable access. I mean, one could say right now, well, I mean, we just have 2 or 3 vaccines and they are ultra cold chain related, and there won't be enough anyways for low and middle income countries. But the next vaccines are on the road. They are 2 to 8. They fit well with supply chains that low and middle income countries have. So maybe this entire discussion around equity and equitable access is maybe a bit over the top. Or, I mean, I'm just trying to get reactions from you guys. So therefore, excuse me when I'm a little bit, pushing. But Gamal, if I may ask you, so how do you see that? Simply wait until 2 to 8 is there, or how can we guarantee equitable access? What needs to be done?
No, that's the question that I think most people are asking now. As soon as the news came out that there's a vaccination for COVID-19, people were asking questions like, how do we get it? Who will get it first, and all that. So we know here in Africa, East Africa, we understand that most of the developed countries will do all they can because of the age factor. Most of Sub-Saharan Africa population is very young. The resistance is very high. and it's the opposite when you look at our developed countries. So yes, we are encouraging and pushing and campaigning to have a global platform where each country can access some sort of a quota or vaccination for their countries. So we are talking to partners and organizations to make sure that sub-Saharan countries or all the developing countries should be able to get the vaccines on time. Definitely, we understand the complexities, we understand the challenges, we understand the protectionism in some countries that they are already, when you look at the number of calls going to Vicer and others for people to stockpiling vaccinations, I think there must be some sort of a way, probably a WHO-led campaign, creating a platform where we can all access. We don't need as much vaccinations as other countries. For instance, in Somalia, very young population, the number of cases are very small, although testing, as you all know, is an issue. But we really want to have an equitable, accessible, and fair and transparent system where we can all get the factors. Of course, it's going to be delayed, going to be priorities. People will be push and pull here and there, but we hope to get it as early as possible.
Thanks a lot, Gamal. Abu, can I ask you for a short answer, maybe 1 minute? I have a strict timekeeper in my back who is pushing me, and they will switch off, I think, at some point. Same question.
Well, I think the COVAX facility was established exactly for this purpose, to make sure that sub-Saharan African countries and Southeast Asia countries will be also getting their fair share of vaccines. So I think that was the whole point of establishing the COVAX facilities, and we have all the partners basically involved in it. So hopefully it will work. I would say though that we had the same issues when the COVID-19 pandemic started, with the PPEs. We had seen, PPEs cargoes diverted, to rich countries, which were actually cargoes for sub-Saharan Africa or poorer countries. But I think it evened out, after a couple of months to really make sure that, there were sufficient PPEs out there, and then the fight for equitable access. But equity is not just among countries. We also need to look at equity within the country itself. Really make sure that we can have the distribution. Those populations who are supposed to be vaccinated, that the vaccinations are getting. That would be really that. I know that the time is not enough to have this discussion, and we can discuss this the whole day. So let me just hand over to you, Hans.
Well, we can always only push on things. So that's how webinars are. Very for fair and equitable access. But what can the private sector do? Is there anything the private sector can do more, better? Is there more space and room for collaboration?
Well, in the 1 minute, I would say always room for more collaboration. And, the private sector has to develop and mobilize the vaccines, produce them at tremendous scale, and then for low and middle income countries, offer them at access pricing that makes it feasible to roll out those vaccines, and work closely with the COVAX and Accelerator to enable that to happen. And my last comment is we have to support UNICEF and the public health agencies in each country, CDCs around the world, including US CDC. My philosophy is if you're not yourself on the front lines addressing this, you have to give your full support to those who are in the front lines. And the public health agencies, they have not been treated as well as they need to. I think the work of the health workers has been well recognized. The public health agencies are also doing phenomenal work, and they need our support, both as governments and as private citizens, to enable them to do what they can do best in getting this pandemic under control.
Well, thanks very much, Gary, especially for being on the point. I would like to thank first of all the audience, of course, for being patient with us, and then the participants in the roundtable as well for their good comments and recommendations. I think there were so many points that I'm not really able to really put them together into a conclusion in a 30 seconds. But what I want to say is we identified a number of very relevant factors right now for this phase after we start having vaccination. We have a number of factors that are adding complexity layers to the vaccination, to the actual vaccination process, and that includes, of course, hesitancy, that includes fairness, that includes as well supply chains to a certain extent, but we have on the other side as well a complexity of and potentially a well set up that is by the sector to a certain extent. So again, at some point, we discussed coming and a very nice day wherever. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.